Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining Withum today. We have a great panel discussion in store for you all. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, you will be on mute during the session. However, at the bottom of the toolbar, you will see a chat box. We encourage you to ask questions at any time, which our speakers will answer at the end. We will also provide you with their contact information. Next, this panel will be recorded for future reference, and a link to it will be provided to all attendees. Feel free to also share your thoughts or input after the webinar has wrapped up, as your feedback is greatly appreciated. And with that, I am going to turn it over to today's moderator, Stephen Monticelli, partner and team leader of Withum's Cannabis Sector Services Group.
Alexis, thank you very much. Happy to be here today moderating this panel. You'll hear a little bit about the speakers very shortly. We're going to allow them to introduce themselves, and we're going to kick this off. But as for myself, I lead the cannabis practice at Withum. We are a full-service public accounting firm servicing clients from Hawaii to Maine to Florida and everywhere in between in the United States in the cannabis arena. Typical full-service public accounting type functions. We do a lot of cost accounting analysis of cost for obvious reasons, and very excited to be here. Our first panelist, Lotta Moberg. Lotta?
Sure. So I'm a co-founder of Vivify Ventures together with my business partner Brian Singer. We allocate capital in the cannabis space broadly. I come from the finance world. I was 7 years in Chicago doing macro investments, and I came into this space very much with a macro thinking. As a result, we've been looking quite a lot internationally, seeing how stalled the regulatory process has been in the US, and we're actually focusing mainly on Lesotho right now, which is a great country to grow cannabis in. So anyone who's interested in that, reach out. We're also looking in the US. We have a credit and equity fund that we are still waiting to launch, and we're also working with cannabis growers with their energy consumption and with the goal of trying to lower energy costs for cannabis operations in the United States.
Excellent. Aaron Lopez.
Thank you, Steve, for allowing me to come on. Aaron Lopez with Political Capital, also executive member of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council. Been in this industry for the better part of 10 years. Own a small lobby shop here in DC. We work heavily in DC and around the country with MSOs and smaller operators, making sure the regulatory landscape works for them. At times we've been asked by the states to come in and help them with some of the legislation. And as that impacts everybody, we're happy to go ahead and have that discussion with you guys today.
Excellent, thank you. And John Clear, finally.
Hi, hello everyone. First off, just apologies. I ended up having to stay at a hospital a little longer for one of my children's medical procedures, so that's why you see all the stuff behind me, so I apologize for that. But my background is mostly in the wealth management, and I worked at Goldman, and I ran the family office, and I've been on the private investment side of this with the family office. We've been involved for over 5 years in states like Oregon, Nevada, California. And then I've spent the last couple of years with CB1 Capital, helping them. They're a long-short equity fund that invests in the space, and I've been working on investor relations. I've also been working with Tampa Group, which is an investment bank in the space, trying to help advise and raise capital for companies in the cannabis space.
Thank you, John. And as we know, this is really a challenge these days because, you know, we often get asked the question, can I make money in cannabis? And of course, it really depends. And I hate to be elusive, but it really depends. I always say that there are 4 essential items to provide an adequate rate of return given a level of risk in the cannabis space. And those 4, the most important thing is the regulatory framework in the licensed state in which you plan to operate in. Access to capital, of course, good management, and certainly the selection of professionals, both accounting and legal, who really know the nuances of the industry. The focus of today's webinar will be on regulatory framework, as each state is its own economy, since federal law does not allow any cross-state border transfers of cannabis products. It used to be that a cannabis-focused entrepreneur would apply for a license in the state in which he or she lived in. Well, I think those days are now gone. So the regulators in each state really need to carefully review their regulations to ensure that private capital will seek entry into the respective states so as to ensure a steady stream of tax revenue that will be sustainable for the states, because certainly that's their goal. Certainly it's a revenue stream, and it's also to protect the interest of the consumers within the state. Many professionals and investors in the industry view the wholesale price of cannabis to be a barometer of the health of each state's cannabis market. And given the fact that it's a commodity, albeit various grades and quality, it's certainly a price-driven market. And, you know, I guess the first question we're going to kick off is we really want to discuss some of the factors which make a state regulatory framework either attractive or unattractive, because we've got a focus in this webinar in the lens of an investor in terms of managing risk and providing a return. And a lot of the regulations get crafted, and I'm not sure the legislators, you know, and I'm not trying to kick any tires here, but I think a lot of things are lost in the translation and trying to figure out what will provide an attractive platform in a state to attract capital, because we're certainly seeing an issue throughout the country in that a lot of the funding for the cannabis companies have dried up in certain areas, but they seem to be thriving in others. And with that being said, Lada, maybe you can discuss, you know, the issue of limited license state versus an excessive supply of license based on the density of the population and such. Let's kick it off with that topic. I don't know if you want to add some color.
Sure. I mean, I can start. First of all, cannabis is this weird thing in the US being so state-based. And it's almost like people's mindset are such that there's something weird about there being a federal component of this. And I think you mentioned the applicants not being from the state where they're applying for. It's almost like in the cannabis space, we think that that's a weird thing, but beware that in any other sector in the US, that's the norm, right? The benefit of having this huge continent being one country and you can move across states is actually something that, you know, it serves the US well. And with all the obstacles that we're facing in the cannabis industry, we would at least, you know, take advantage of as many of those factors as possible. So I just want to make that point. Like in economics, it's basically if goods can't move, then people move. Right? If goods and people can't move, then capital move. So us seeing that being like on the federal basis, the labor and the capital, we're going to have a lot more of that in the cannabis space than in any other sector, because we cannot move the goods around. The different states and the different regulations, you'll hear it all the time that, well, we want to be limited where there's limited licenses. That's generally true. I mean, it's always the case that if you get a monopoly of something, then you want to hold on to that monopoly. Every state had a different kind of environment when it comes to, well, you might read about a place being unlimited licenses. Well, it turned out that was only on the dispensary side, maybe, or maybe only on the growth side, and you want to be a dispensary. So there is the growing, and then there's the manufacturing and dispensary side. Sometimes it's a great thing to be a manufacturer or dispensary where you have unlimited licenses, because the flower price goes down so much, so a lot of people will come to your license. You'll be buying flower more cheaply. So it's not this all blanket, like prices go down, that's bad for the cannabis industry. There is an integration, there is the different verticals here. And so it really does depend on what vertical you're in. And I think we should be careful about saying, stay away from that state because it's unlimited licenses, for example, which is often what you hear people saying.
But Lada, that's a good point. I mean, certainly the laws of Adam Smith's supply and demand economics work in, you know, given the fact that you've got all of these various states, call it roughly 40 states with some kind of legalized program. We're looking at those as their own economy, given the fact that we can't cross state lines. And to your point, I think it's a very good observation that some verticals may be more successful in states, but others may not, based on what the economics are. And certainly things change. We've seen states improve their economics by a change in some regulations, and we've seen others issue too many licenses and almost like an open platform, to the point where eventually enough capital comes into the state, and lo and behold, the wholesale price of cannabis, a perfect example, the East Coast state, Massachusetts, has really matured very rapidly over the last year with a lot of players in the market. And so I, admire the fact that the Cannabis Control Commission in Massachusetts has done a great job in bringing in a lot of cannabis revenue for the state. But, to my knowledge, there's already been one good-sized receivership in Massachusetts, and I don't know. And when we've got that kind of supply and demand, and supply starts exceeding demand, there's going to be some shakeup. The next item to really talk about is some of the license and renewal fees that we're seeing across different states. It's all over the place, Lotta. I don't know if you'd want to just kind of give us some color on that, because there's flat fees, there's variable fees, there are fees there are a couple states that really stick out in my mind. The state of Rhode Island has a $500,000 renewal fee for 9 dispensaries. They call them compassion centers there. That seems pretty excessive. There's also New Jersey that has, if you were one of the 12 original licenses at the medical, on the medical side, to convert to adult use, if you had 3 dispensaries, there's a conversion fee of $1 million. And so when we look at these excessive fees and we compare it to what's being charged in the remaining states, it seems to be all over the place. So wonder if you could add some discussion on that.
I can start. I'm sure either John or Aaron know more about the specifics of this, but as a general matter, $500,000, $5 million, $10 million, whatever it is, there's no price that is obviously too high. The government is sitting there. If the people in the government is rational, in the sense that if they raise money, they get paid more, which is not always the case, but in many cases, governments just try to get as much revenue as possible. And if they thought that nobody would pay 10 million, they wouldn't put a price of 10 million in. And this is also a point about the limited licenses. What you lose out in quantity, you take back in price. And if you get, meaning if something is in low supply, guess what? It has higher price. So this is the government creating their monopoly. I mean, obviously they can create the monopoly that they want in terms of, they make something up that is called, well, if you were in the bread business or clothes business, you don't need this, but we determined that here you need a license because we call this a drug. In any other space, the optimal amount of license is unlimited. And there's no reason why in cannabis they shouldn't be the same. The only reason is so you have a revenue source for the government. It's I just want to make the point that we want to be careful about limited licenses always being this thing that people see as helping cannabis companies. It helps them. Well, the people who got in get some kind of monopoly protection. The purpose is to raise money for the government, and at the expense of increased prices for consumers and fewer people being able to obtain cannabis.
That's a very interesting insight, no question. And what about restrictions on activities?
Stephen, if you don't mind, I'm going to talk a little bit more about
Sure.
that. And being with these regulators quite often, I often think some of them, having helped write some of the laws in Virginia and West Virginia and some of these other places, their look at it is, when they make it a limited market, first of all, a lot of, especially in the southern states, what they're really doing is trying to control it because they don't like the product to begin with, and they want to make sure that it doesn't automatically just flip to a adult use market, and they see sometimes this limited market as a way to control it, as the way to control the expansion. And I don't know if it's necessarily a lot of just for the money, because you've got states like Virginia that the renewal fee is like $15,000, $20,000. but then you've got Florida where just the application fee this last round was 149,000. And so it's really all over the place. And you had some states, we'll take West Virginia, they almost didn't care at all about the application or renewal fee. They go, oh, we've got money because the state allotted them enough money to do this. And I think that you had brought it up before, with this separation from state to state to state, what makes it difficult, and I think why some of the MSOs look at a limited liability or limited license state, is because they do get that protection. They do say, hey, well, look, I'm going to come in there. I've got a massive investment that I'm going to get in, and I want to protect it. Even with the states that have an open, like Mississippi or some of these others that have an open, the first guys to get their license, the first thing that they want to do is turn around and say, okay, let us grow first before you open it even more. And I think it's a growth protection as well. So yes, the states are going to want to get their pound of flesh, and you do have states in California, Massachusetts, New York, and everything really looking for some of that revenue. I think other states are really just looking at it as a regulatory control.
Interesting. So John, given the checkbook that you control in terms of deploying capital, would you feel better with a limited license state and you've got an entrepreneur who's got a license in hand or a tentative license, or would you feel better about an open platform where you've got a lot of licenses?
Well, you definitely feel better in a limited license state just because there's obviously less competition. But, I think what we are seeing, though, from that perspective, where you're going to write a check and how you're going to write a check, is I think people forget, this is a business that is fighting against an illegal market that other industries do not have to. And we're also at the point, with Minnesota passing adult use, that we are now over 50% of the population has access to adult use or is in the process of getting access to it. So, the limited license has been very beneficial for many of the businesses in the early stages because they've been able to box out and to have positions that they might not otherwise have. But I think it's become less and less of a factor. And I mentioned the illegal and I mentioned the other states because the price compression of cannabis as a commodity is starting to happen. And it's happening faster in places like New York and New Jersey than it did elsewhere. So I think, yes, you would prefer a limited license state, but I think we're moving into the realm of having businesses really dictate, business models more so dictate where investment dollars should go.
John, that's a really good point, actually, because, when you look at the legal framework of just, corporate law, I'm not an attorney, I'm a CPA, but we've got this Uniform Partnership Act that some states have adopted, terms and conditions of what is and what is not in terms of a model. I think it would be a great step for the industry to move towards a set of regulations that states can adapt, because at this point, if I'm a state regulator and the revenue's not coming in terms of what we were expecting, I'd be looking to the regulations that were in force and say, okay, how can I attract capital for the firms in the industry in our state so that we can get back on track? So Aaron, I don't know if you want to take that and run with it a bit, because it certainly sounds like, utopian type arrangement, but anything goes in the legislative process.
Yeah, I think it's always fascinating. And, Connecticut was a good example of this, and some of these other states. The first piece of legislation brought up usually is vastly different than what actually passes, mostly because you get a lot of different, and I think you teed it up really well in that they want a business to come in, they want a business to do well, and they want, employees to be able to provide, and they want all these things to come in there, but then small groups and like I said, I feel bad that I work with some of these guys sometimes, so they say, well, I want my part of this, and so it changes it, and then it changes, and these laws become more convoluted, they become harder to deal with, and then to add on, as we've already stated, we've got different set of federal rules that also are pressing down. You've got tax issues that you could speak to, more than I can, but people trying to fix that, and the model that you end up with at the end of the day. So even if you had a standard that you're able to say, hey, this state did it well, maybe this state ought to do it. A lot of states are going to say, well, if California's doing it, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do the exact opposite, and vice versa. Or if California's doing it, this is the way I want to do it. But all of them can, because they're separate groups and because they're separate economies, they're all going to put their spin on it, which does make it hard to keep track, because all of them are changing, all of them are trying to update as well and trying to stay on top of it. With that being said, just your question at the very end or the very beginning is, can you make money in this when you're looking at all these models? I loved your response. Yes, it's a very good lawyer response. It depends, especially with what you're going into. The great thing is you've got 40 different models now to go in and look at to evaluate, well, what do you want? Do I want it limited, or do I want it unlimited? Do I want to go here? And you get to kind of pick and choose where you want to be. We're maturing far enough now that you could make it work with your model.
Understood. Various regulations in states have restricted, certain types of product selection. They've restricted advertising. And recently in Rhode Island, the most recent General Assembly changed the regulations to allow cannabis to actually advertise within the state of Rhode Island. Before this happened, the state of Rhode Island is relatively a small state. The dispensaries in Massachusetts were advertising, and it was legal for them to advertise in Rhode Island. And the Rhode Island residents were being lured into Massachusetts, and the Rhode Island license holders that were paying X dollars a year for a license were prohibited from advertising in their own state. And these people just went absolutely berserk. And I think I'm happy to see that it's changed, but at the same time, I think it's those little elements of the regulations that really need to be fine-tuned. And on that same point, there's a significant trend right now for states to decouple for 280E. And it only makes logical sense, because you are literally granting a license, and at the same time, for the licensees not to be able to take a deduction for a legal state license that was issued seems to be very illogical to me. And there is a great trend right now. New Jersey's decoupled, Maine's decoupled. There's been quite a few states that are taking this into the general assemblies and making some changes to the laws in this capacity, which is welcoming to the licensees. On that same note, John, I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit of the experiences that you've seen with labor peace agreements in light of Green Thumb Industries employees who just unionized in the state of Rhode Island. And I keep referencing Rhode Island because there's been quite a few changes recently.
Yes, the labor agreements just make it harder just with anything to operate. We're working with such tight margins when it comes to 280E and a lot of the other, because of all these regulatory things, the legal expense to run these businesses is pretty high. So when you throw on other obstacles, and like you mentioned, it's mostly an East Coast thing, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, all have different types of labor things that are included in their packages. So it's another obstacle that these cannabis companies need to confront when going to market and raising capital.
Understood. And what about excise taxes? Clearly, the states are getting their 7%. Some states exclude the medical products. Can you talk a little bit? Some states are imposing it on dispensaries. Some states are imposing the excise tax for cannabis on the customers.
What's happening in California is that they shifted it over to from the cultivators over to the distributors, and that really caused a lot of strife. A lot of where the taxation happens is pertinent to the businesses because they've been self-financing. So if you create product, then the next person in the chain, you're giving them credit to be able to take the product to the next stage. And so it's where the tax is that's important. So obviously it affects the consumer when it's at the end of it, but it affects the businesses more as it's further down on the line. So I think, California is a perfect example of them trying and tax in all different parts of the chain, and then focusing in on other parts and then breaking that. And, I think effectively the whole thing is that it's just too high of a tax. And it's affecting the margins. So we're paying 280E tax, we're paying state tax, consumers are paying more. So it's just, again, going back to earlier, it's the states trying to create revenue and trying to do it in a way that is not beneficial for the businesses.
Understood. That's a great point. My next topic, maybe Aaron can participate to some extent, because the legislators in various states have devised what they consider to be, big business versus, the limitation of the number of licenses that can be owned by any one given person. I'm trying to figure out the difference in culture. And the two states that really come to mind in my eyes is Florida, which has a very unique model that is really a very interesting model. There is no wholesale price in the state of Florida, where it is a completely vertical environment. So what you grow is what you manufacture, and what you distribute in terms of your dispensaries. You have an unlimited number of dispensaries that you can open in the state of Florida. So Florida has clearly focused on the large operators that will come into the state, and they have shied away from the smaller operators. As a corollary, Massachusetts has a rule of 3. So you can have up to 3 adult use and up to 3 medical licenses, but no more. And it is just a cultural difference, I think, between the legislators and how they wanted the marijuana programs to play out within their states. And I don't know if you want to just discuss this a little bit, Aaron. I'm just kind of leaving that as an introduction, but.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think once again, back to my statement of, where do you want to play? How do you see your business model? And you're right. You got some operators in Florida with 100 dispensaries open. Some as little as 10 or whatever. But you're right. You grow it, you process it, you ship it around. Some have up to 2 million square feet of grow space in Florida. And with 800,000 registered patients, it can support it. And then with this next round of licensing, they're opening up they have 22 licenses, they're opening up 22 more with the addition of the Pickford licenses as well. And I think Florida is in a unique space. They could support it. I think they can. Massachusetts, on the other hand, I think even to a degree with New York, with what they're doing with their adult use market, they're trying to find a way to build generational wealth. They're looking at these smaller groups and trying to figure out if everybody can participate, some people are going to be able to do this and really build generational wealth. The problem with it is when you do limit it to that 3, you're basically buying yourself a job. And depending on where your dispensaries or your products are located, what's your rent like, what's other things that it comes in play. You can make a very, very good living at it, but it's a vastly different model than what the Florida is. The Florida are basically what you're saying is kingmakers, and you can come in and really, and everybody wants to be a part of that market. Massachusetts, I think you were alluding to it. You're seeing a bit of an attrition to it. The same thing like we saw with Oklahoma and others. I think, and I'm actually going to fanboy a little bit with Lotta here and ask her a little bit, because you're getting to this idea of social equity, and when you come into investors and the states want to have everybody contribute, so they say, well, look, we're going to really limit this, or you've got to be from a socially economically depressed area, you've got to only be able to make a certain amount of money, or you've got these certain backgrounds that they're looking for. And I'm thinking a lot of, when you guys look at these types of people, what's your willingness to actually invest in groups like this? Because they don't have generational wealth. They're usually from a group that doesn't have family money to invest in, and how you guys kind of evaluate those type of things.
I mean, if you want to be in the cannabis space with the objective to not only like make money and profit for yourself, but also benefit certain underprivileged groups. That's certainly what we're doing. But if you were born underprivileged in the United States, you still one of the top 1% of the world. And that's why we're looking to Africa, where you can really make a big difference. You hire people there for $2,000 a year if they're not skilled, for example. When it comes to the U.S. situation, I feel like your observations there, Aaron, go to the point of like, when can you make money in cannabis? You're gonna have to pair your skills with the state. If I am like to, if I like to squeeze juices and have my juice stand, I can do that where I fit in culturally and where I like to live. Cannabis, you're gonna have to cut down some of those like criteria for yourself, because you're gonna have to seek out where the product maybe that you're thinking that you come out with this wonderful pre-roll. That's a great idea. Guess what? Other people have thought about that before. But some states might still have like the good place to come in with your pre-roll, but you're gonna have to go, because the world is sliced up like this. Again, because you can't move the flower, you're gonna have to be more flexible as a person. And of course, when it comes to assessing where to put capital, the capital have to be not state specific, but that's usually not the problem. But yeah, I would definitely, like, if somebody goes, I mean, I've met people who like, yeah, I'm gonna kick ass in Florida, and there's not that many operators there and all that thing, and it's like, yeah, only if you are the kind of operation that should be a conglomerate. There's a reason why conglomerates were a big thing in the past, like 150 years ago. That was kind of the standard in any kind of sector. And why that is not the case now. Like, division of labor actually kind of works. And here in the States, we're basically saying, just like you were saying, Aaron, 3 each so that you can create generational wealth. So I got a better suggestion for us. We'll abolish all the grocery stores, you produce all your food, and we create jobs for everyone. We know why that is not the best solution, and that's exactly what they're doing in the cannabis space. And you just have to navigate that as an investor, operator. It does mean that every state becomes its very unique universe.
That's a great point. Interestingly enough, in many of the states, I can understand from a regulator's perspective in light of what transpired a few years ago with the vape situation that was going on. Public safety is first and foremost, and that certainly needs to be addressed in the regulations. But I think, if we had 40 regulators on this webinar, which I would love to share this webinar with the regulators, because I think many times they get into the weeds of the finite details of trying to put this in and trying to put that in, and what they've done is they've created an environment that's not attracting capital for the firms that they've just licensed, especially in the social equity applicant area. And Aaron, I'm hoping you can kind of discuss this a little bit, because we've done a lot of projections and we've seen a lot of struggles with social equity applicants in particular raising capital, because the person with the checkbook who's writing the check is really looking for a clear path to a return given limited risk that is being taken. And I don't know the complexities of a lot of the state regulations surrounding social equity applications, and the waterfall that's permitted to these participants of what you can and cannot do clouds that connection of the return and the risk. And I'm hoping you can give us some color on that from what you've seen.
So I mean, the timing of that question is pretty good. I'm in my student time, based here in DC, because I just got off the Hill having a bunch of these types of discussions with various senators, trying to get safe banking modified a little bit to help. Safe banking, like I think I said before the call, was we just celebrated 10 years of us trying to get safe banking across the line. Safe banking was great 10 years ago. We're going to have to change a little bit, because what we're noticing is exactly what you're saying. We have the first African-American woman in New Jersey who got a medical license, who was given 2 months to say, hey, you need to show us your financials in 2 months that you're solid enough to be able to do this. Self-funded, for everything, so you're being asked to do all these types of things. New York and New Jersey being the prime example of this, they really passed out these golden tickets to everybody, as if everybody just won the lotto when they got it. I got a lot of phone calls trying to match people like John and Lotta up with these guys to try to figure out, how do we do this? How can we but they were realizing really quickly that they didn't have the education, they didn't have the training, and even with the state's best intentions, New York, for example, has this $200 million fund that they want to set up to pass out. First of all, they've only raised about $50 million of that, and they haven't really told us what's the criteria to actually get those into the hands of these things. Then you have other states where I met with regulators in Illinois. They've really tried really hard to get their program up and running, but they don't know how to make that connection between these equity applicants and them and getting the money. And in early days, they had a couple banks that the state picked in Illinois that you just said, hey, we're going to go ahead and this is who the state is working with to fund these equity applicants. And then the bank is turning these applicants down for these loans. So how do they, the thing is that there are people out there willing to work at. You have to be careful with it because there is predatory lending. There's these other aspects out there. I mean, and this is hard money, and they call it hard money because it's hard to get. I don't really know if that's why they call it that, but it's this idea of where do I go? How do I get access to these funds? So a lot of these, applicants, yeah, they got their golden tickets, yeah, they got their license, but they're also turning them back in because they don't have the funding. And it's just doing your homework and trying to figure out. And so that's why I'm really fascinated with this call is, can you do it? You've got to be mindful with what you're doing and how you're getting. You can't rely on others. This isn't 5 years ago where everybody was just getting money no matter what. It's a lot harder to access that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, on that same topic, it was interesting. I think over the last 2 weeks, New York, one of the things we can't really estimate in each of the cannabis markets is the prevalence of the legacy market. Although it exists everywhere, I think it has differing degrees of how it plays into the market, whether it's legacy or the black market versus the licensed market. Clearly from a consumer's perspective, if their product that they're purchasing from a licensed market is being lab tested, you've got a certain amount of comfort level that you're buying a product that is safe for you. And you're not getting the same in the legacy market, despite the fact that the price may be less, but you're paying for that assurance that you've got a safe product. But New York had a recent crackdown on literally non-licensed stores that had storefronts that they had rented, and they made a pact. Not only were they going after the unlicensed operators, but they were going after the landlords for leasing the space to an unlicensed operator. And quite frankly, I think that's a great step in New York's direction of really trying to bolster the ability for the licensees to make money in the space. So I think the more enforcement that all of the markets can have on the legacy market, the better off the consumer will be, and the better off the firms in the industry will be. So I don't know if, John, you want to add some color on that, or Lotta, Aaron?
Yeah, New York is in a unique situation because they held off on a lot of the initiatives. First off, they had a good thought as to how they wanted to move forward, but the thought was not a capitalist thought. It was more of a thought about how to help people. Hold on one quick second, I'll be right.
I can add, my impression is actually that Illinois and New York, it's a little bit similar. I've been mostly around Illinois, and when it comes to the Illinois story is that they issued licenses like almost 10 years ago, mostly went to big operator MSOs, and then the last couple of years they've had these like craft grower license. But it is one of these, like, be careful whether like you win the lottery ticket, is it a win or blessing or a curse? you know, it goes to Aaron's point of like, oh, well, how can they not raise money? Well, maybe because there was a lottery and the government allowed some winners, and that doesn't mean that necessarily that person is the right person to run a business. And I think that's
and I'm
something
going to
that
impart there the most recent example of that is in Alabama, where they brought in a school, the University of Southern Alabama, to help grade the applications and the processes for Alabama. Had them all go through, announce the winners of the licenses, and then there was such an uproar with the people that won it that they have now had to restart the process. And this is not the only state. It's happened in different variations in Nevada, in Massachusetts, in New Jersey, even in New York. And so, yeah, a lot of this is there seems to be different buckets of different people that apply for licenses. People that are actually ready to execute on that license and have the finances and have all the real estate and everything else. And then there's people who, you know, put in the application and are not prepared. And the people who are not prepared are the ones that have made it a lot harder for the people who are. And you know, I think it's all of this stuff, as we've been saying, is a state by state thing as well. You know, New York has they've tried to lighten some of the regulations in terms of product testing to be able to cure for the fact that the farmers in New York have been growing and have product that they need to sell. So that was one of the first things, and they tried to do a couple of other different things to try and you know, blunt the problem, which is the fact that there's just too much product and nowhere to sell. And so, you know, the long and short of kind of the entire thing here, especially like as I was speaking before, between limited and non-limited licensed states, it really comes down to the preparedness of the license applicants, preparedness of the government, and the willingness to be able to think of cannabis as most of us do on this call, as a non-harmful product. And, you know, people who are selling it, whether it be in the illicit or the legal side, their goal is not to hurt people. And that's, I think, another thing that people need to understand. You know, when you look at the illegal side of the market, you look at people who are distributing it, of course there are bad players, but the reason that exists is because people have used it and need it for medicine for hundreds and thousands of years. And so it's a very, you know, a lot of the legal framework and a lot of the scare tactics that are put into this are more based on what people's perception are of the, you know, of the safety of cannabis, when cannabis cannot kill a person based on consumption. You know, so it's like, you know, a lot of this too just has to deal with the fact that if we were actually dealing, in fact, we actually knew people were as educated as we are about the plant, the cannabis plant, that a lot of these things and a lot of the states and a lot of their actions would be a lot different.
John, I'm glad you brought that up, because chronic pain is the #1 reason why people use cannabis in the medical market. And I've seen patient testimonials in the medical markets that are just riveting. I mean, this is like, you know, they've tried everything in the pharma side, and then bam, they've resorted to cannabis and they found something that works for their ailments. And certainly in the future, we'll see medicine and cannabis intersect, now that some of the research is now really being launched now in the United States. And I do know Israel is way ahead of the curve on this research, and it would be interesting. Eventually, the United States will catch Israel on the curve on, you know, the marriage between cannabis and medicine. So it's going to be interesting. Stay tuned over the next, I don't know how many years this is going to take, but it's going to be a very remarkable uncovering of what cannabis can actually do on the medical side. So the next topic that I just wanted to throw out there was, you know, the timing for some of these states when they finally approve, okay, we're going to have, let's say, adult use, how long it takes the regulations to actually get molded and actually launch, and people to raise capital and do a build out. There's a long cycle there, Aaron. I don't know if you want to just add some color there.
Well, once again, it depends. Some states it takes longer. I mean, you've got Florida that has been, you know, you have participants there that have been trying to get it to go recreational for a very long time. Then you have states like Virginia that went recreational just a couple of years after it introduced the medical. And some will say that the Virginia model went too fast, and thus that's why you see a kind of a coming back to the current governor has kind of kiboshed a lot of the legislation moving it forward, keeping it from actually opening up the market. But it's NCSL, National Council of State Legislators. They asked me a question once. Which state is doing it right? I couldn't answer. Who is doing it right and who is giving access to small players, or who's doing it. It's so different. The needs of every state, the needs of the local people, that what is right. I mean, you brought up the vaping issue before and the advertising things, because we've also have this federal pressure. The advertising comes from the FDA. What can you say about your product? What are you allowed to say about your product? Does it help? Does it hurt? Does it change something? Well, then the FDA is going to come involved, whether it's regulated by them or not. They're going to come in and have a say. And we've seen a lot of letters sent by them, a cease and desist. You've got other aspects with the vaping, the flavoring. We saw some products, and these are things that are being entered into your lungs, and so there's other safety concerns that people are just buying off of Amazon to put into their product. Not saying that you can't get a good product yet. So where does regulation help? Where does it hurt? Where is it smooth? And it's an ever evolving thing. And sometimes, to your point, Stephen, maybe if done right, and we use examples, it'll take 6 months for legislators to do it. But to John's point, this is a whole new topic for these guys. They're uneducated on it, and this is where people being involved in the education process and get involved. I'm gonna make a call for it. Get involved with your local legislators. Update them, let them understand it's going to be a process then for them to learn about this. Alabama's issue was that they asked a bunch of people to score these from the university, that they had 3 weeks of training on what to look for and how to score. How do you do that? Instead of asking a firm like you, Stephen, to come in and you've got it, you understand, you're methodical about it. How are you going to do it? And but these were just a call for a bunch of experts who to donate their 6 weeks of their time to look at this. So
it's a valid point. It's a valid point. In the crux of what we're talking about in this discussion, John, what are you seeing in terms of the current state of the capital markets? We have a lot of clients that are looking for capital, either for expansion or for a launch. And if I think back to the various Benzinga conferences over the past couple of years, a couple of years ago in Chicago, there was both a blend of people looking for money and a lot of people with checkbooks. And then at the most recent conference in Miami in April, there were a lot of people looking for money and not a lot of people showed up with checkbooks. So John, what are you seeing in this space?
So, given that I come from the family office world, I think a lot of families, because, well, again, remember, we can't go to the normal institutions to get the capital that we need. So most of it comes from high net worth and family office individuals. And, like the experience that I had with the family office that I run, we invested 5-6 years ago and invested in projects that we thought had the correct operators and we thought had the right business model. One of the, there were a handful of investments, half of them did well and half of them didn't. But we are still working through solutions. So the reason I bring that up is because I think a lot of people got very excited in the family office and ultra high net worth world to invest in the space and deployed a lot of capital and didn't think about the fact that this is more like a venture investment where you need to think of it over a 10-15 year time frame, and you also need to deploy over that time frame. So what I see in the marketplace when speaking to people looking at venture/private deals in the space that are coming to market, and the CB1 Capital relationship I have, where I'm speaking with families about investing in the public side of the market, it's pretty much the same. Families, if they've had exposure, are either done, they want to get out of the space and they don't want to look back, or they've made an investment and they're waiting for some relief to be able to deploy more capital. So what that just means is that it's extremely more scarce to find people who are willing to invest. And I think maybe the theme of that might be that, you know, the money is still sitting on the sidelines, not just because of 280E, but because the early adopters and the people that put money into the space have not had any relief and have pretty much had a bad experience at this point. So you have two major factors going against you, with the major overhang that you just can't go to the bank and get an SBA loan. So it's a very constrained market, and so therefore any opportunity for people to step away, to not be involved, they're taking that opportunity. And I think, you know, as we move forward, even though we have all the regulation and things in front of us, my argument still is have an exposure in the public markets and look at private deals and deploy your capital in that way as an asset allocation. So, you know, you have the public market exposure while you're also making investments in private companies to make sure you have a diversified approach to how you're investing in cannabis. Well, most people have made their investment and are just waiting for something to happen. And the people that are on the sidelines that I have these conversations with, they're willing for some of the relief to happen. So they're okay with the first 10, 15, 20%. So if safe banking passes, if we get other types of regulation that move, they're okay with that because they know that there's so much more still in the future for them to have from an investment standpoint. So this time period that we're in right now is kind of like a great reset when it comes to capital. So companies are always going to need capital. It's just more exacerbated in this period of time. And it's more, you know, in your face that they need it because the cash needs are so immense. But on the flip side, now if you say, okay, what about deploying capital? When you're deploying capital now, as opposed to 5 years ago, you're deploying capital into companies that are operating cash flow. Well, first off, 25% of the businesses in cannabis are not cash flow positive. So the ones that are starting to stand out more and more. But also the ones that are operating now are finding business models and ways to adjust and take advantage of, you know, what if we are a consultant and not touching the plant, all of a sudden we're able to take away 280E taxes. And I know, Steve, you have special ways, Stephen has ways that he works with his clients to abate taxes, but all of that has sprung out of the last 5 years of people losing money and not operating these as businesses and thinking that they'll be in a limited license state, they'll have a first mover advantage, they'll make good margin, and then they'll be able to deploy that capital going forward as states come on. Well, we're past that. So now you have to have an operating business that can't take advantage of margins and has to take advantage of compressed pricing. So the business models have to change. That's what's happening. And I would say, you know, that's kind of where the capital is being deployed. Both the public markets on places like TerraSend, you know, that are going into different markets in the Canadian exchange to be able to access the capital markets and the capital that they need. And then you have other companies on the lower end and on the private end that have different business models than what we're looking at 5 years ago.
John, that's a great observation. You know, one of the things I have to mention is, you know, we've seen quite a few acquisitions by way of reorganizations with public companies in the past couple of years, 2 or 3 years. And over the last year and a half, that has completely dried up because the public company pricing is considerably adjusted in terms of where it was in the past. And I think, you know, the public companies have stopped doing acquisitions with their stock because when you look at it, you know, why does the company do a stock buyback? This is almost the reverse of that. They don't want to do a deal and take a risk with a low stock price. It would be dilutive to the shareholders. And so, as you pointed out, as legislation changes, whether it be, you know, some safe banking version or maybe some form of legalization at the federal level, when you look at the bite that cannabis has taken out of alcohol and tobacco, I would be shocked if the alcohol and tobacco companies, the public companies, wouldn't scoop up the big players in the cannabis sector, especially in light of where the stock prices are now. So very interesting observation, and it's going to be a great seat to watch how this unfolds. You know, in light of what we've been talking about in a lot of, since you've got the PhD in economics, you know, we have a lot of clients that come to us and say, okay, you know, we're looking to sell in X number of years and they've just entered a state or they've been performing in a state, and the states have all adopted, whether it's adult use or medical programs at different times. And there are some similarities and dissimilarities, not only in the population density, the population, the regulations. Can you speak a little bit about almost predicting the maturity of a market that has come on board with regulations that looks like or is similar to other markets in terms of the timing of how long that other market may have taken to mature? And I know it's a difficult question because there are variables that can't be isolated. It's not a controlled study.
Right. I won't be able to tell you exactly the timeline because it seems to vary a lot, and I can pull something out of my hat and sound authoritative, but that would be fair. I think the one way to think about this too is we talk about maturity of the market because we observe that prices go down when you get more supply. I would say no market in the US is mature in the sense of you still don't have your soccer moms on board, and you still have, like, there's so much on the consumer side that we just haven't captured yet, in part because the products are not out there, because people don't want to produce products out there if the consumer base is not there. And it takes time. A lot of people are really excited about beverages. Nobody can make money out of beverages right now. A lot of that is, of course, because when you bottle something and you can't ship it outside your state, you just really, the economics, even CBD even is also really hard. So yeah, I would say following any state, it's you end up looking at each state as its own little creature, and even if prices have come down, well, that just means that the cultivation price has come down, so it's mature in that way. But there's going to be a lot to do on the product side in so many states, I believe. So there are opportunities. Just really depends on what you're doing in the space.
Understood. Thank you. We're going to open this up for questions in a little bit, but one of the things that I wanted to talk about is branding. It seems like every one of our clients comes to us and they literally, they create this brand, and I step back. And all of us try to measure a rate of return on investment dollars, especially in the marketing area. And branding is just it's this esoteric thing. When you look at the history of Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola has branded to become what it is today. It took approximately 135 years. It's noted that successful branding requires large advertising budgets, especially when a new brand is being established. As a company grows and becomes well known, then they typically scale back on their advertising budget, since most consumers now begin to recognize the brand. And Coca-Cola has continued to keep pressure on its competitors with great branding. The company spends 10% of its revenue on advertising and marketing. And so when I look at the history of Coca-Cola, and then I look at the cannabis brands that are coming online, and when you look at some of the earlier branding companies, I think they had a difficult time launching maybe 5 years ago or so. And now we're starting to see brands roll out through the country, and they're using their IP in various states for operators to create the product and replicate what the original product was. And given 280E, we're not seeing anyone really commit significant dollars to their branding efforts. And I just wanted to open up this discussion with this panel because, if I'm a cannabis company launching and I want to establish my brand, and given the fact that I can't take a deduction for my branding activities because those are not deductible under 280E, what are your thoughts on that? Aaron, maybe you can share some pain points on this.
I think it's interesting that you bring this up, and you see California. There's a lot of brands there that's what they're turning to. You're right. They're now licensing, their brand. They're going to other companies and taking them to Pennsylvania or whatever. While they can't produce it, they don't have a license there. They know that they had a product. It was a very well liked product, so they're taking it and licensing it to others. And then you're seeing some of these companies jump on it and saying, "Hey, look, we've got, Moxie, we got all these other things. We got these other brands that are coming out there that that they're now able to launch all the way from California, and they're able to say, and people, oh wow, and California is still known for quality products. It might be hard to still make some money there, but they've got some very well known brands there and coming out. But we're also seeing celebrities getting into this. I mean, Sean Puffy Combs has gone into it. Snoop Dogg has versions of it, and others that are coming through. And I love Lotta's reference of conglomerate, because you see those guys really at going after some of those, and they not only have their brands because they're in a bunch of states, they're now being able to come back and license these other brands with them. You've got the Bellamy brothers, you got Willie Nelson, you've got some of these others that are starting to find these fans in across. It's still hard to advertise, and you're not going to see a name on a stadium anytime soon for this, but it's trying to establish that, and while we've talked about these states being locked product-wise, I think Lotta made the things, but people are fluid, and people are going from state to state and able to see, oh hey, that's the same product I get in somewhere else, and it helps in that regard. And I'm sure the other guys have some thoughts on it too.
I would say there's no other space in cannabis where licensing out a brand makes more sense. Does that make sense? If Coca-Cola were in cannabis, they would not be plant touching. They're not. They don't even touch the beverage. They issue SOPs, or not even the full recipes as we know. Like, I don't know exactly how it works, right? The feds have created this situation where what you have to determine, and this might not be obvious to everybody listening here, so you have to determine whether you're plant touching or not. If you're plant touching, you fall under what's called 280E, which means that you can't deduct any expenses except for the operating expenses, which is generally called COGS in accounting speak. There are two reasons why that licensing model that you describe, Aaron, makes so much sense. It's like, one, well, because of the fragmented situation, it's better to have try to do something that it's not so choppy, right? Like Coca-Cola has a market of 7 billion people. And most cannabis companies have a market of maybe 7 million people. So just having the expansive market is one thing. And the other thing is the getting away from touching the plant. I'm sure a lot of these brands, you mentioned getting over the tax for my branding operations. Well, the whole thing is to create a branding operation that is not plant touching. So you can have a company that creates a brand that doesn't touch the plant. So that's, it's just an artificial thing from the feds. Like, if I'm getting taxed on this, but not on that, I'm going to be separating out the activity. And if you want to understand anything about separating activities, you can always call Withum, right?
Thanks, Lotta. And just one point of clarification. We spend a lot of time focused on what we can include in inventoriable costs, because believe it or not, that is referred to as an adjustment to income in arriving at gross profit. So anything we can include in inventory, we can actually reduce the gross income for purposes of taxation. And anything that is a selling general administrative expense, it gets trapped in 280E and we can't take a deduction. The downside of what we're talking about is, we've got companies, in order to really brand themselves, they've got to spend money on marketing. We can't really get that in cost of goods sold. That is a deduction that is pretty much eliminated by 280E. John, I don't know if you want to add some color on the branding side.
In kind of all the comments I have, I think this is a good wrap up, because I think the businesses that are getting financed now are the ones that are focusing on what I like to call an asset light model, which again is basically a branding company. And so being able to access the infrastructure that you need for a brand and replicate that process is in many ways where the industry is going and where people who are investing in the space are looking towards. And if you look at the big MSOs, they are now moving past, like I mentioned before, CapEx, and building into the infrastructure of the business, and they're more focused on brands and how are their brands positioned, what brands do they want to bring in, what segments of the markets do they want to go after, and how are they spending their marketing and how are they getting their message out there. So it's part of the evolution of the industry and where it's going towards. But I do think, given the historical nature of Coke and other similar businesses like that, it is true. I mean, it's going to take a long time for these brands to develop. So I would argue 90% of the brands that we know, even at the big MSOs, will probably not be in existence as cannabis becomes a mature market, but the businesses that created them will be in existence.
But just real quick, Stephen, for your advertising, there is a difference between what Coke can do advertising-wise and what a cannabis company can do advertising-wise, and what they can say and what they can depict and what they can show. And I mean, we even seen that it's even hard for some hard liquor. You don't see cigarettes being advertised the way they used to. So there is some of that other pressure, I think, as Lotta was alluding to before, this federal pressure downward on what they're able to do in creating these artificial markets of what can and can't be done.
Excellent. So we're going to open this up to questions, and let's see if we've got anything in the chat. Alexis, is there any questions that have come out? If not, we're going to continue talking about the couple things relative to everyone's viewpoint on federal legalization at this point, because at some point Congress will play nicely in the sandbox together, and we may see some form of federal legalization. So, Aaron, what do you think that looks like? I mean, my own viewpoint is that each legislator in each relative state is going to want to protect the revenue stream in their states. So I think we're going to have some form of a States Act on legalization of the product. When you look at 40 states, 40 plus states with some form of cannabis company today, I think there's a good chance we'll have a States Act and we still legally won't be able to cross state lines. Of course, that opens up an enforcement issue when there is some kind of federal legalization, and I don't know what that looks like. But yeah. I don't know. What are your viewpoints on some kind of legalization?
So there's going to be a bifurcation of the industry between the medical and the legalization and what can still be. The states are still going to want to have some sort of control. The companies are going to want to have some kind of local control done over them rather than being regulated by the FDA. I think there's a bunch of companies right now, if the FDA were to come in tomorrow, they couldn't operate because of the strict CGMP rules and other things. So there almost has to be, a separation there mandated into the system for it. I think there's going to be some protectionists in there as well, not just from a state level, but a federal level too. You legalize, you're opening up not just state borders, you're opening up federal borders as well, and you're going to see incoming from other things. So there are impacts that are going to hit us. And to your point, you're going to have to implement some kind of protectionist in there, some kind of local home rule, event to go ahead and still organize it. And I think for the most part, people are looking that if a state still wants to keep it illegal, they're going to have that authority to do it. However, we're a long ways away from having a stable piece of legislation that will get passed, in the next 5 years.
Excellent, thank you. John and Lotta, I would like to focus on some of the questions that have come in. So let's punt back to the questions, and maybe we can pick up any other discussions on this point after the questions. And the first one is, a Massachusetts dispensary writes, do you see any movement to streamline the renewal fees as we get closer to 100% state participation? Meaning that states will tend to streamline the fees as the domestic market gets more mature. Is there any potential without federal legalization that these get streamlined either due to pressures from the operators, especially the MSOs, with multiple different renewal structures? And I think that is, John, I see you raising your hand on that one, but so why don't you roll with that one?
Sure. I think when we get to that, ultimately, this will be something that we'll have interstate commerce. People will choose which states that they would like to operate in, and we'll be in a regime where pretty much most states, the costs will be the same. right? So when you think about that, when that happens, how that happens, it's down the line. I mean, you could think of alcohol licenses in states like New York and New Jersey, where I live and I'm familiar with. You know, there are limits to those, and there are price tags associated with those, and they do differ between states, but they aren't millions of dollars to get those. So you know, there will be more uniformity, but I don't anticipate in the early stages of this that the cost for licenses will shift from, you know, call it the operator to the consumer. I do think that there will still be, you know, a lot of the states. Look at New York. New York is a perfect example. You know, they're talking upwards of $10 to $20 million in fees that are going to have to be paid over a period of time for the registered operators to go over to the legal side. So that's years still. We're still talking, you know, years from this date that New York will still be in that regime. And even though we still have half the population, there's a lot of states that are going to look at this as a quick way to get bucks. So, you know, yes, over time, will it happen? I just do not want to prognosticate as to how long that will happen, but I will say that it will happen. But if history is any example, these things will take way longer and be less smooth than anyone anticipates, and specifically in cannabis.
Excellent. Well, hopefully, sorry, Lada, go ahead.
I would just add, like, I'm sure hoping that there will not be any streamlining for the benefit of any cannabis operator. It's similar to states coming together and agreeing that they all should have a minimum, you know, income tax. We haven't seen that in the United States yet. Hopefully that's not going to happen. It allows people to go to the states where the regulations that they like, and it puts some pressure on states so that they can actually decrease the fees in order to attract more investors and more cannabis operators.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. I'm just looking at some other questions here. I got some comments. I'm just, hold on one second. All right. So next one is, someone writes, the consumers suffer either way, whether the government limits the number of licenses, thus making entry into the industry almost impossible, or if they tax cannabis to oblivion, increasing the prices of cannabis, the consumer always suffers. Well, you know, I don't know, Lada, if you want to take that and just add an economic viewpoint.
There are two ways of taxing: quantity or price. It's an accurate observation in that way. Like, the government, you know, is bad for me as a consumer if it increases the price or increases the quantity. That obviously increases the price. So that in that way, it's correct. But as we've been talking about too, I mean, when it comes to the license side, there is a competition between states, and there is also if the states wants to maximize revenue, the optimum price of a license is not infinite. Right, there's going to be some, and I'm not saying, and Aaron will correct me, like, they're not all, that's not all that they're doing. There's more to it. I get that, and that's absolutely right. And I'm not the one who had worked with regulators, but if we think about that aspect of it and them wanting to do that, that's, you know, that is your lot in life as a citizen of a government. They are going to take money from you. So in what way they do that? Yeah, you know, there are two ways of doing it. But hopefully you won't get, hopefully there will be enough licenses, but yeah, that's the difference between states, you know. So yeah, there's not that much to say about that comment, right? It's correct, but it only looks at one direction, which is government decreasing the quantities, increasing the price. And some governments do the opposite and are not as bad,
So we're coming up on 2:15. I'd like to thank Lada Moberg, Aaron Lopez, and John Clear for joining us today. A wealth of resources. I'm going to ask Alexis Blacknick to actually send this recording to some of the legislators across the country, and let's see if we get any traction and any phone calls. There's a wealth of advice on this webinar, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I thank every participant, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
so.
Take care.